There was a night when, if humanity acted incorrectly, the new year would not arrive as it should. Not because of missing fireworks or unspoken wishes, but because time itself could fall out of rhythm. In the ancient world, New Year's Eve was not a celebration. It was a fragile interval, where the old year had exhausted its force. Yet the new year was not permitted to appear. That night belonged to no year at all, and anything without a name, without a place, carried risk. The old world did not enter this night with hope. It entered with caution, because it was believed that if the cycle closed incorrectly, the consequences would not arrive at once. They would spread, slowly, across the entire year that followed. In older memory, the final night of the year was not naturally safe. Order did not protect humanity by default. The rules that once held the world in balance began to thin, like cloth stretched to its limit. There were no loud warnings, no immediate disasters, only a faint, familiar sensation that everything was suspended in between. The old world did not need to explain that feeling. It simply acted as though it were real, because time was not understood as a straight line moving forward. It was a circle, and every circle, when nearing its closure, created a gap. That gap was where danger emerged. Not the danger of death, but the danger of continuation. If the old year was not ended properly, it would cling. It would cross the threshold. It would cause the new year to begin out of alignment. This was why the old world did not believe the new year was guaranteed. In ancient thinking, the new year was not a rite. It was a result. And to reach that result, there were actions that had to be done and actions that must never be done. The final night of the year, therefore, was not a time to add more. It was a time to stop. To stop at the correct place, at the correct moment, not too early, not too late. Because any haste could cause the cycle to close incorrectly. No one spoke the name of that fear. Yet it existed within every repeated gesture. Every familiar movement passed quietly from one generation to the next, not as tradition, but as a survival reflex. Today, New Year's Eve is wrapped in light and noise, but beneath that surface memory, it was once a night of vigilance, not vigilance against an enemy, but vigilance over the rhythm of time itself. Humanity stood between two years, not to celebrate, but to ensure that the world would continue to move as it always had. And to understand why this night once carried such weight, it is necessary to return to how time was once understood, not as a line advancing forward, but as a turning circle that could close correctly or close incorrectly. In the ancient world, time was not imagined as an arrow moving forward. It did not aim toward progress, nor did it carry the promise that tomorrow would inevitably be better than today. Time was felt as a slow rotation, repeating itself, surviving through rhythm. Each season returned to its proper place. Each year closed so the next could emerge. But when a cycle reached its final point, that stability was no longer guaranteed. The end of the year was where the circle endured its greatest pressure, where even the smallest deviation could send the entire cycle slipping from its familiar path. The old world did not say that time could break. It behaved as though it could, because it had witnessed years that began incorrectly, not through a single clear disaster, but through a quiet sequence of misalignments. Crops arrived late, bodies weakened, relationships within the community grew tense without anyone understanding why. These signs were not seen as random. They were understood as the consequences of a cycle that had failed to close completely. Within this understanding, time did not operate on its own. It had to be kept in rhythm, much like fire needed tending or soil needed planting at the proper season. The end of the year, therefore, was not a neutral marker. It was a threshold where everything could remain aligned or begin to drift. And once that drift occurred, there was no way to reverse it. One could only live through an entire year in that state, waiting for the next closing of the cycle to attempt correction. This is what gave the final night of the year its particular weight. Not because it marked an ending, but because it determined the shape of what followed. On that night, time became thin. Familiar boundaries between old and new, between finished and not yet begun, overlapped. Within that overlap, human action could not be careless. Every gesture had to be in rhythm. Every action had to have a reason, even if that reason was no longer spoken aloud. The old year, in this context, could not simply pass and disappear. It carried every trace of the cycle that had just been completed. If it was not ended properly, those traces would cling, spilling into the new year like a slow contamination. And this was what the old world feared most. Not ending, but continuation done incorrectly. For this reason, before anything new was allowed to appear, a rigid principle had to be established. The old year could not continue. It had to stop completely, right at the threshold. And to accomplish that, specific actions were required. Actions not symbolic, but necessary. Actions that would emerge as the night deepened, beginning with the extinguishing of the forces that had once held order in place. In ancient thinking, the old year did not disappear simply because humanity stepped into a new day. It existed as an entity that had completed its function. It had carried the seasons through their full rotation. It had held the rhythm of life within permitted limits. It had borne the full weight of time. And at the end of its cycle, it no longer possessed the strength to continue. If it was dragged forward, if it was not stopped at the proper point, it would become a burden on what followed. The old world did not view the old year as something evil, but it understood that anything extending beyond its proper span becomes dangerous. A tool used for too long will break. A fire kept burning too long will consume the very place it once protected. The old year was the same. It had to be allowed to end, not through forgetting, but through a clear, decisive act. Without that, the boundary between old and new would blur. And it was that blurring which carried the real danger. In ancient traditions, the most dangerous thing was not ending. It was uncontrolled continuation. A cycle that failed to close correctly would spill into the next, carrying with it what should have been left behind. This was not called misfortune. It was called misalignment. And once the rhythm was misaligned, everything that followed had to strain in order to adapt. For this reason, the end of the year was not a time for accumulation, not a time to carry forward, not a time to hold on. It was a moment of firm separation, deciding what belonged to the year that had passed, and what must never be allowed to cross the threshold. In that moment, decisiveness mattered more than hope. Hope could come later. But if the boundary was breached, no hope was strong enough to repair a cycle that had closed incorrectly. The threshold of the new year, in ancient myth, was not merely a temporal idea. It was a sacred point of transition. Whatever crossed that threshold would shape what came next, carry what was right, and the cycle continued. Carry what had exhausted its force, and the cycle began in a weakened state. This was why the old world treated what was allowed to pass through the final night with such care. The old year, therefore, was not permitted to continue on its own. It had to be stopped, not through words, not through intention, but through action. These actions were not purely symbolic. They were concrete mechanisms meant to ensure that the completed cycle truly closed, leaving no residual disturbance. And among all of these actions, one was always performed first. A signal that could not be mistaken, announcing that the old order had reached the moment to withdraw. It was the moment when the familiar lights within the home were extinguished, and the world entered a brief, necessary darkness, where the old year could no longer cling, and the new year was still not allowed to appear. In the ancient world, a threshold was never only a physical boundary. It was a point of transition where everything changed state. To cross it was not simply to move from one place to another, or from one day to the next. To cross a threshold was to accept a new order, with new rules and new consequences. For this reason, what was carried across a threshold always mattered more than what was left behind. At the end of the year, that threshold did not exist in a doorway. It existed in time itself. And time, when it becomes a threshold, does not allow everything to pass together. The old world believed there were things so bound to the old year that carrying them forward would cause the new year to begin in a weakened state. Not because those things were evil, but because they had completed their role. To carry them onward was no different than forcing an exhausted body to shoulder a new cycle. The greatest fear of the final night was not loss. It was continuation done incorrectly, extending a fire that had already burned long enough, extending a tool that had already worn thin, extending an order that had exhausted its strength. In ancient thinking, everything had a lifespan aligned with its cycle. Beyond that span, even what once protected could become a danger. For this reason, the end of the year was not a time to hold on to what was familiar out of fear of absence. It was a time to face the most difficult question: what should not cross to the other side? This question was not answered through personal reasoning. It had been answered long before through repeated actions passed from one generation to the next as a form of collective memory. No explanation was needed, only correct action. In ancient traditions, people avoided carrying the marks of exhaustion forward. Objects that were broken, things that had lost their function, signs that the cycle was weakening, not out of superstition, but because these were understood as indicators that the old year had reached its limit. To bring them across the threshold was to deny the necessary ending of the cycle itself. The threshold of the new year, therefore, was carefully guarded, not with weapons, but with selection. Only what still possessed strength, order, and alignment with the new rhythm was allowed to pass. Everything else had to be left behind, not in resentment, but in acceptance. Because if the threshold was violated, if the boundary was blurred, the consequences would not arrive at once. They would spread quietly through each day of the year that followed. From this fear of carrying what should not be carried, the ancient world understood that the first act of protection was not to add anything, but to extinguish. To extinguish what had once maintained order, confirming that the old cycle had truly ended. And that act, however brief, always took place in silence. When the familiar lights within the home were put out, opening a necessary moment of darkness for the transition to occur. In the ancient world, fire was not only a source of warmth, it was the sign that order was still present. When a fire burned within the home, the world remained in a stable state. Everything had its place. Every action followed a rhythm. Fire held darkness beyond the boundary of living space. For this reason, extinguishing a fire was never a casual act. It occurred only when a cycle had reached an ending that could no longer be extended. At the end of the year, the familiar fire within the home was put out, not because fuel had run out, and not because the cold had passed, It was extinguished because the old order had to be allowed to withdraw. In that moment, people accepted that the structure which had kept everything functioning had completed its task. To keep the fire burning was no longer protection. It became coercion, forcing a state that had already exhausted its strength to continue. The old world understood that there could be no rebirth without darkness. Light only carries meaning when it returns after a true absence. For this reason, the brief darkness following the extinguishing of the fire was not considered dangerous. What was dangerous was refusing to allow darkness to appear at all, refusing to let the old cycle die completely. An order that will not withdraw cannot make space for a new one to form. The moment the fire went out marked a point of no return. It declared that the old year had ended, not on a calendar, but within the operating structure of the world itself. There was no familiar light to cling to, no daily rhythm to soften the feeling of vulnerability. Humanity stood within that darkness, not to act, but to remain still in the correct place while time reorganized itself. This darkness did not last long. It was not permitted to last long, but it had to exist, even briefly, even just enough to break the continuity of the old cycle. The old world believed that if this step was skipped, if the fire was kept burning uninterrupted through the year's final threshold, the new order would be built upon a foundation that had never been cleared. And such a foundation would carry invisible tensions from its very first day. In the silence after the fire was extinguished, there were no loud prayers, no wishes, no celebration, only attention directed toward the present moment. An awareness that the world was suspended between two states. And in that state, any unnecessary action could disrupt the rhythm of transition. Only after the darkness had fulfilled its role, when the old order had truly withdrawn, was fire allowed to return. But it was a different fire, no longer an extension of the old year, but the first sign that a new structure was beginning to take shape. Before that light appeared, the most necessary act was not to do what came next, but to leave undisturbed the emptiness that had just been created. Because it was within that emptiness that the new cycle began to form. When the final fire had been extinguished, what mattered was not lighting it again immediately. In ancient thinking, the space between two fires carried its own weight. It was the moment when the world was no longer held by the old order. Yet the new order had not appeared to replace it. This pause was not meaningless emptiness. It was a necessary phase where continuity was deliberately broken so the cycle could reorganize itself from the beginning. The old world understood that if this pause was filled too quickly, if new light appeared the instant the old light vanished, then no true transition had taken place. The cycle had merely been extended in another form. And a cycle that was not allowed to end properly would carry its own tension into what followed. For this reason, waiting was not passive. It was an active act, sustained by discipline and restraint. During this pause, people did not seek to create new meaning, nor did they attempt to repair or improve anything. The only requirement was non-intervention. Time, when left undisturbed at the threshold, was believed to recalibrate its own rhythm. Any unnecessary action could interrupt that process. Silence, therefore, was not the absence of activity, but the presence of a principle. Action does not always produce order. The pause between two cycles was also the moment when people became most sensitive to what remained from the old year. Without familiar light to conceal it, every trace of the completed cycle became more visible. What had grown tired, what had cracked, what no longer belonged. In this stillness, The old world recognized that not everything could continue. Some things, though once useful, had become burdens. For this reason, the pause was not only for time, it was for observation. People looked back not to indulge in regret, but to make distinctions. What had completed its role? What should not cross into the next cycle? This was not a personal decision. It was the continuation of a collective understanding shaped over many rotations of time, an understanding formed by past misalignments whose consequences had been clear enough to never require repetition. The pause ended when these distinctions had become sufficiently clear, when it was understood that for the new year to emerge without carrying misalignment, the living space itself had to be cleared. That space was not only the momentary suspension of time, but also the places where people lived, stored, and accumulated the memory of an entire cycle. And from that realization, the next step became unavoidable. What belonged to the old year had to be moved beyond the boundary of living space, so the threshold could open without obstruction. When the pause had completed its role, the ancient world did not rush to seek new light. Instead, people turned back to their living space, not to decorate, not to prepare for celebration, but to empty it. At the end of the year, cleaning carried no aesthetic meaning. It was a structural act, meant to ensure that the new year would not be built upon what had already exhausted its strength. In ancient thinking, a house was not an inert object. It remembered. It accumulated. It carried the traces of every cycle that had passed through it. Old ash in the hearth, broken objects, items no longer used but still present. All of these were seen as material expressions of a year that had completed its course. If such traces were not removed, they would continue to act as anchors for the old cycle, blurring the boundary between what had ended and what was about to begin. People did not clean because they believed in cleanliness. They cleaned because they believed in distinction. The end of the year was the moment to answer a single question: what had finished its task? Broken objects were not kept to be repaired, not because repair was impossible, but because they represented a state that was no longer whole. Keeping them meant keeping a sign of fatigue, of a cycle in decline, and such signs were not permitted to cross into the new year. Old ash was carried beyond the boundary of living space. Waste was discarded. Objects that no longer served a function were removed entirely, not in anger, not in regret, but in acceptance that everything has a span of existence aligned with the rhythm of time. When that span had passed, holding on was no longer preservation. It became obstruction. This cleaning took place in silence. There were no wishes, no grand rituals, yet its logic was unmistakable. The new year could not step into a space that had not been emptied. The home, like the body, had to be released from unnecessary accumulation before it could enter a new cycle. Otherwise, the new year would begin under compression, constrained by what should have been left behind. For this reason, in ancient traditions, a house left uncleared before the final night was not merely considered careless, it was considered dangerous. Not because it was dirty, but because it retained too many traces of the old cycle. And a space like that, when carried across the threshold of time, would bring unnecessary residues into the year that followed. When the cleaning was finished, the living space felt lighter. Not because it was more beautiful, but because it was less tethered. And within that lightness, the ancient world prepared for the next step of the final night. A step no longer concerned with objects, but directly with the self, when even familiar identity itself began to carry risk. In ancient thinking, A house was not merely a shelter. It was a living presence alongside humanity, breathing in rhythm with daily life, accumulating the traces of each passing season. Every wall retained sound. Every shadowed corner held habit. Every object placed down carried the memory of the moment it was used. At the end of the year, when the cycle reached its closing point, the house was believed to hold the full weight of the old year within it. For this reason, emptying the living space was not only about removing material objects, it was a process of releasing memory. What had witnessed too much fatigue, what had remained present during the days when order began to weaken, the traces of tension, scarcity, and fracture. All of these were understood as belonging to the old year, and therefore could not be allowed to continue in the same form when the new cycle began. The old world believed that if the house was not emptied, it would continue to whisper to the new year in the voice of the old one. Not through words, but through sensation. A heaviness without clear cause, fatigue arriving sooner than it should, an unease that could not be traced back to a specific event. These were not considered random. They were signs that unreleased memory had crossed the threshold alongside humanity. Within this view, the house resembled a body that had carried illness for too long. If it was not cleared at the proper moment, that body would carry the seeds of the old cycle into the new one. And in that condition, even if the new year arrived, it arrived already influenced, without sufficient space to shape its own rhythm. This was why emptying the living space became a requirement, not to create lightness, but to prevent the spread of misalignment. The moment the house grew more sparse was also the moment when people began to feel themselves more clearly. When familiar objects were removed, when old traces disappeared, the space became silent in a different way. That silence no longer concealed human presence on the final night. And within that emptiness, an awareness began to form. Not only space carries memory, humanity does as well. The old world understood that if a house could carry residual weight from the old year, then people themselves, with their habits, identities, and familiar roles, could also become carriers of memory across the threshold. Once the living space had been emptied, the next question became unavoidable. Whether a person could step into the new year while remaining entirely what they had always been. And from that question, a deeper unease began to surface. That on this lawless night, even a familiar face could become a risk. On the final night of the year, when the living space had been emptied and familiar light had not yet returned, an unsettling realization emerged. Objects were not the only things that carried memory. People did as well. Identity, in ancient thinking, was not something fixed. It was a composite of roles, habits, social position, and repetition across an entire cycle. And when that cycle ended, the familiar identity itself became something potentially dangerous if carried forward without restraint. The old world believed that the final night was when boundaries grew thinnest. Not only the boundary between the old year and the new, but also the boundary between humanity and what no longer belonged to everyday order. In that moment, appearing with a familiar face, a familiar name, meant placing oneself back into an old position within a world where protective rules had temporarily withdrawn. And such a position, when order receded, could be called upon in ways that were never intended. This was why, in many ancient traditions, people did not appear as themselves on this night. Masks were worn, forms were concealed, voices were altered. Sounds grew louder, more chaotic than usual, not for play, not for entertainment, but to blur identity. When faces were no longer clear, when familiar roles were obscured, people believed they could pass through the lawless night without being recognized. In ancient thought, being recognized during an unstable interval was a risk, not because of a specific pursuer, but because the act of being named, defined, placed back into a former shape could draw along what should have been left behind. The identity of the old year, if not temporarily set aside, would cross the threshold with the person, carrying the full inertia of an exhausted cycle. Masks, therefore, were not symbols of deception. They were instruments of safety. By covering the face, a person allowed themselves to become anonymous for one night. And in that state of anonymity, they did not represent the old year. They did not carry former roles. They became temporary forms, indistinct enough to avoid attachment, flexible enough to wait for a new order to appear. The outward chaos of the final night, noise, movement, distorted shapes, was not meant to create disorder. It was meant to disrupt familiar recognition. When everything became difficult to distinguish, the risk of being named diminished. And when no one was named, people could cross the threshold together without carrying the personal imprints of the old cycle. But concealing the face was only the first step. Once individual identity had been temporarily removed, a deeper question surfaced in the night. If the living could hide themselves to cross the threshold, then who else might be allowed to appear in this liminal span? And from that question, a presence long anticipated, not of the living, but of those who had passed through many cycles before, began to be prepared for with careful attention. On the final night of the year, when faces had been covered and familiar roles temporarily set aside, the old world understood that people were not only hiding from the outer world, they were withdrawing for a time from the very structure that had defined them throughout an entire cycle. Identity, in ancient thinking, was not an immutable essence. It was a position held within order, and when order withdrew, that position was no longer protected. Carrying an old identity across an unstable threshold was considered dangerous, not because that identity was wrong, but because it was bound to a cycle that had already completed. It carried the inertia of habits, obligations, and relationships shaped within a specific span of time. When that cycle ended, that inertia needed to be released. Otherwise, a person would enter the new year already being pulled backward. On this lawless night, people avoided calling one another by name as they normally would. A name was understood as a kind of anchor, fixing a person in their former shape. To name was to confirm identity, and confirming identity during a transitional interval could allow what had not fully ended to continue clinging. For this reason, ambiguity was deliberately preserved. Who was who no longer mattered. What mattered was crossing the night together without being held in place. This temporary anonymity did not weaken people. On the contrary, it allowed them to become flexible. Freed from old roles, they could stand within the final night as forms not yet defined, waiting for a new order to appear and assign position once more. This was not loss. It was a necessary suspension, where identity was set down so it would not carry weight that no longer belonged. In ancient communities, this was not chaotic. It was understood and repeated each year. People knew that identity would return, but not immediately. It returned only after the new year was permitted to emerge, when the new order had grown strong enough to hold everything in place. Until that moment, clinging too tightly to identity was seen as an act of carelessness. Within this state of anonymity, the boundary between individual and community softened. People no longer stood apart in their roles. They became part of a collective guarding the threshold of time together. And when every face was concealed, when every name was set aside, the final night became a rare moment when humanity did not represent individual lives, but the cycle itself in the act of transition. Yet even with the identity of the living temporarily removed, the lawless night was still incomplete. For in ancient understanding, if the boundary had opened enough for people to hide themselves, it had also opened enough for other presences, those no longer carrying the identity of the living, to draw closer. And this was not unexpected. It had been anticipated from the beginning. On the final night of the year, the appearance of the dead was not considered an anomaly. It was expected. When the boundary between cycles grew thin, when the identities of the living had been temporarily set aside, the ancient world understood that this space no longer belonged exclusively to the living. And so, those who had already passed through more turns of time were permitted to draw near once more. The dead, in ancient thinking, did not return to intrude. They returned because the cycle required witnesses. The closing of the year was not only a moment of the present, it was a point of convergence, where past, present, and what had not yet taken form touched one another. Those who had lived, ended, and crossed the threshold of time were believed to recognize whether a cycle was closing correctly. Their presence was not threatening, it was confirmatory. For this reason, in many ancient traditions, space for the dead was prepared in advance. An empty place was kept, a meal left untouched, a door left not fully closed, not to invite disorder, but to acknowledge that this night did not belong solely to the living. Failing to prepare for such a return was considered careless, like leaving an essential place vacant in a ritual that required all witnesses to be present. What mattered was that the dead were not called by individual names. They did not return with personal identity. Just as the living had temporarily removed their faces, the dead appeared as a collective presence, not bound to separate stories. They represented memory longer than a single lifetime, a rhythm that had been held across many cycles. Because of this, their return did not disrupt order. It reinforced it, reminding the living that the world had crossed similar thresholds before and continued on. On that night, no one sought direct communication. There were no questions, no pleas. Presence was acknowledged through silence and by maintaining proper distance. The living did not move too close. The dead did not enter the spaces of ordinary life. The boundary remained, but softened, allowing witnessing to occur without collapse. This anticipated return completed something essential. It ensured that the final night was not enclosed within the perspective of the present alone. The cycle was viewed not from within a single life, but from a longer stream of time. And when those who had already ended were present to bear witness, people believed the transition was unfolding correctly. But that witnessing did not last. It existed only long enough to fulfill its role. When it was complete, the final night still held one remaining demand. For even with witnesses present, even with identity set aside, the cycle still had to be guarded until the new order was strong enough to appear. And for this reason, no one was permitted to abandon awareness during the remaining hours of that night. In the ancient world, fear was not directed at the dead. Fear was reserved for lack of preparation. When ancestors were anticipated in advance, their presence did not disrupt order. On the contrary, it helped order remain intact at the most fragile moment of the cycle. The old world did not regard ancestors as wandering spirits in need of appeasement. They were understood as those who had completed their role and therefore could see the full turning of time more clearly than the living. Ancestors did not return to intervene. They did not repair. They did not judge. Their role was simple, yet essential: to witness. This witnessing carried a meaning very different from supervision or control. It confirmed that what was unfolding aligned with the rhythm that had been maintained across many generations. When the old cycle closed under the presence of those who had already passed through many cycles, the process was considered valid, unbroken from the longer current of memory that extended beyond a single lifetime. For this reason, the old world did not attempt to drive ancestors away on the final night, nor did it try to hold them close. Everything was kept in careful balance. An empty place, a door left slightly open, a silence that was respected. Presence was acknowledged, but not disturbed. Because any excess, whether fear or invitation, could destabilize a time already thinned to its limits. What mattered was that ancestors did not return carrying personal stories. They did not arrive as father, mother, or under a specific name. They came as condensed collective memory. Their anonymity mirrored the temporary anonymity of the living. Both met in an intermediate state, where individual identity was no longer central. What mattered was that the cycle was closing correctly. Within that presence, the living were not permitted to panic. Panic was seen as a sign of lost position. It suggested that people had forgotten this night was not an intrusion, but a threshold long expected. Remaining calm, remaining silent, maintaining the behaviors passed down. This was the only way to preserve balance when boundaries softened. When ancestors had completed their role, they did not require elaborate farewells. They withdrew on their own once the cycle had been confirmed. There were no clear signs, no announcements, only a faint sense that the shared space was gradually closing again. And when that presence faded, the final night did not end. It entered its last phase, where responsibility rested entirely with the living. The responsibility to keep awareness in place, guarding the threshold until the new year was truly permitted to appear. When the witnessing of the ancestors had withdrawn, the final night did not become lighter. It became more empty. And within that emptiness, responsibility shifted entirely to the living. There was no one else to rely on. No longer the long memory of those who had come before, standing at the edge to confirm the passage. What remained belonged to those still present, the ones who had to ensure the rhythm of transition did not break. In the ancient world, this was the moment when vigil began. Not vigilance against an enemy, not the anticipation of strange signs, but vigilance over the self, guarding awareness so it did not drift, guarding against anyone abandoning their position before the new order appeared. At this stage, the final night did not permit release. It demanded continuous, quiet, wakeful presence. The old world believed that when awareness left, people became most vulnerable. Not because the body weakened, but because a position within order was left vacant. Deep sleep on this night was not considered rest. It was considered an opening. And on a night when boundaries were thin, every opening carried risk. No one wished to become the break in the chain of vigilance. For this reason, the night of vigil was not loud. There was no celebration, no excitement aimed toward the future. People remained together, sitting, standing, or moving slowly within the emptied space. Wakefulness was maintained through small rhythms, exchanged glances, steady sounds, simple movements enough to remind one another that awareness was still present. There was no leader, no grand ritual, only a shared understanding that this night could not be left unattended. Vigil was not kept out of fear of what might arrive. It was kept because of what was not yet permitted to arrive. The new year, at this point, had not appeared. It had not been confirmed. And without that confirmation, any lapse was seen as carelessness. The old world did not ask when the new year would come. It only understood that if vigilance was held long enough, if no one abandoned awareness, the new order would find its place on its own. The night of vigil extended without clear markers. There were no hours to count, no signal to announce the shift. Time was no longer measured in minutes or seconds. It was measured in continuous presence. As long as people remained, as long as awareness was held, the cycle was being protected. And within that silent duration, one truth gradually became clear. The final night was not crossed through grand action, but through not leaving too early. For the new year, when it arrived, did not come to be welcomed. It came when vigilance had been held long enough, and when the new order could stand without any further support. During the night of vigil, what was avoided was not darkness. What was avoided was deep sleep. The old world did not regard sleep as a neutral act in this moment. Sleeping on the final night of the year was not simply rest. It was a withdrawal from position. And on a night when every position was being held in place for an order that had not yet appeared, that withdrawal carried risk. The old world believed that awareness did not exist only within the mind. It occupied a place within the structure of the world itself. When awareness withdrew, that place was left temporarily empty. During the day, order filled that absence. On ordinary nights, sleep was protected by familiar rhythm. But on the final night of the year, when the old order had stepped aside and the new order had not yet formed, nothing automatically filled that vacancy. A position left empty could weaken the continuity of the vigil. For this reason, deep sleep was considered dangerous, not because of dreams or fear. It was dangerous because of loss of presence. When someone slept deeply, they no longer responded to the shared rhythm. They no longer held gaze, no longer maintained movement, no longer remained part of the collective awareness guarding the threshold. On a night where everything depended on no one leaving too early, sleep became a form of retreat. This did not mean people were expected to be tense or strained. The night of vigil did not demand rigidity. It demanded presence. Sitting still, standing still, moving slowly, breathing evenly, keeping eyes open. These small acts were enough to signal that awareness remained in place. The old world did not stay awake through fear. It stayed awake through responsibility. In many traditions, children and the vulnerable were kept close to others on this night. Not because they frightened easily, but because they were most likely to drift out of the shared rhythm. Keeping them within sight preserved the continuity of the vigil. Everyone understood that if someone slipped into deep sleep, the night's cohesion weakened. No blame was spoken, only quiet adjustment to draw awareness back. Sleep, in ancient thinking, was always tied to thresholds. It was a passage crossed each night. But the final night of the year did not allow uncontrolled crossings, because the boundary was open and every passage had to be considered. To sleep deeply at this moment was to leave the present before the present had been secured. That was why wakefulness was maintained until there was a clear sign that the new cycle was stable enough to support itself. Only then did sleep return to its proper place. No longer a risk, but part of the new rhythm taking shape. But before that moment, the old world understood that the final night could not be crossed by closing one's eyes. It had to be crossed by remaining, until time itself confirmed that the threshold was safe to pass. In the ancient world, the final night of the year did not end in joy, at least not immediately. While the vigil still continued, While awareness still had to remain in its proper place, all forms of celebration were postponed. Not because joy was forbidden, but because joy too early could cause the cycle to close incorrectly. The old world understood that there were moments when even emotion had to follow order. Celebration, in ancient thinking, was an act of confirmation. It declared that something had been completed, that danger had passed, that the new order stood firmly enough to allow release. But on the final night, at this point, none of that was guaranteed. The new year had not yet appeared. It had not been permitted to enter. And without that confirmation, any expression of closure was considered careless. The old world did not count down. It did not search for a precise moment to erupt in sound. Time now was not measured in numbers. It was measured in state. As long as the transitional state remained, celebration remained suspended. No one asked why. Everyone understood that celebrating before order returned could blur the boundary even further. The prolonged silence was not an absence of feeling. It was a form of collective discipline. During this interval, people did not turn their attention forward, nor did they look back at the past. They stayed with the present, holding it long enough so it would not slip away. This demanded a restraint that the modern world has largely forgotten. But in ancient thinking, restraint was not sacrifice. It was the condition that allowed joy, when it arrived, to be full rather than hollow. There were no congratulations during this phase. A greeting was a form of calling, and calling something before it was ready could cause it to arrive incomplete. The old world did not call the new year. It waited for it. It understood that if everything had been done correctly, if the vigil had been held long enough, if no one had abandoned their position, the new year would find its way in without being summoned. For this reason, the final night was not cleanly divided into before and after. It was an extended interval where everything remained suspended. There was no signal announcing that it was now safe. No bell, no sudden flare of light. Only the continuation of staying, quiet and alert, until a very subtle shift appeared, not from human action, but from the felt sense of the world itself. And when that shift arrived, it did not come like an explosion. It came as a gradual settling, a sense that the emptiness had been filled, that the tension of the night had eased. Yet even then, the old world did not rush to celebrate. Because before joy could safely appear, one more thing was required. A sign confirming that the new year was not only arriving, but had been permitted to remain. In ancient thinking, the new year did not appear automatically simply because the night had passed an invisible mark. It required confirmation, not through declaration, not through a clear signal, but through a shared sense that order had returned to its place. After the night of vigil, after prolonged restraint, people did not rush to believe that danger had passed. They waited, and this waiting was not passive. It was the final part of responsibility. Confirmation did not come from people. This was the crucial point. The old world believed that declaring the new year too soon could summon it before its foundation was strong enough. For this reason, no one stood to announce that the moment had arrived. No one signaled the others to release their hold. Instead, attention turned towards subtle shifts in the surrounding rhythm. Not through hearing, but through the awareness that had been sustained throughout the night. These shifts had no distinct form. There was no sudden flare of light, no supernatural sign, only a sense that the strain within space had eased, that the thinness of the boundary no longer pressed against every movement, that remaining present no longer required effort. In that moment, the old world understood that the new order had begun to stand on its own, stable enough to hold itself without constant vigilance. This confirmation did not arrive all at once. It spread slowly, like a gentle wave. One person noticed first, another noticed later. But no one rushed. No one demanded immediate agreement. In ancient thinking, true order did not need to be enforced. It was recognized when people collectively felt that they were no longer standing at the edge of the threshold. For this reason, the moment was not marked by grand action. No new ritual was added. Everything remained minimal. Because if order was strong enough, it did not need proof. It revealed itself through the return of stability to rhythm. Shoulders could loosen, tension could soften, movements could become natural again. All of it unfolded in silence. What mattered was that this confirmation did not erase what had just been endured. It did not negate the vigil. On the contrary, it existed as the direct result of no one leaving their position too early. The old world understood that if any step before had been missing, if the fire had not been extinguished at the right moment, if the pause had not been held long enough, if identity had not been set aside, if awareness had not been guarded, this confirmation would not arrive, or would arrive incomplete. Only when the sense of stability had spread widely enough, only when no one had to actively hold anymore, did people allow themselves to recognize that the threshold was safe. Yet even then, they did not call it a beginning. For in ancient thinking, before anything could be welcomed, there had to be one final moment of recognition that the new year had not only arrived, but had been permitted to enter and remain. In ancient thinking, the new year did not arrive as an event. It did not come with loud sound or a clear signal. It entered, quietly, almost without a moment that could be precisely named. No one saw it arrive. People only realized it was already there when everything began to hold itself without needing to be guarded. This distinction mattered deeply. If the new year were something that could be summoned, people would believe they controlled it. But the old world understood that the new year was never under human command. It appeared only when the necessary conditions had been fulfilled. When the old year had been properly ended. When the old order had withdrawn. When the pause had lasted long enough. When both space and people had been emptied of what no longer belonged. For this reason, the moment the new year entered was not marked by deliberate action. No one stood to declare it. No one signaled a beginning. The new order did not require verbal confirmation. It confirmed itself by holding its shape. People sensed this through the return of stability in the surrounding world, through the way simple actions no longer required careful calculation, through the way awareness no longer had to strain to remain present. At this moment, a new fire could be lit, not as a continuation of the old flame, but as the first sign of a different structure. Light returned no longer as protection, but as definition. It declared that the new order now possessed a foundation strong enough to exist without relying on what had just been set aside. People still did not celebrate, but restraint no longer needed to be held so tightly. Bodies loosened, breath deepened. The living space, emptied and reordered, began to carry a different rhythm. Not the extended rhythm of the old year, but the rhythm of a cycle that had just been permitted to begin. Everything remained quiet. Yet this quiet was different from the earlier pause. It was no longer tense. What mattered was that the new year carried no promises. It did not guarantee improvement. In ancient thought, the new year brought only one thing: the capacity to continue. That capacity was not a gift. It was the result of the previous cycle having been handled correctly. The old world did not expect the new year to repair what had occurred. It required only that the new year not be infected by old misalignments from the beginning. Once the new year had been permitted to remain, people were no longer standing at the threshold. They stepped into the new order naturally, almost without noticing. And only after that stability had spread deeply enough, only when there was no longer fear of slipping backward, did the actions delayed throughout the night begin to find their place. But what the modern world calls celebration was, in the ancient world, still only the next step in a much longer process. A process whose original meaning has slowly been replaced over time. Once the new year had been permitted to enter and the new order had grown stable enough to hold itself, what once unfolded on the final night began to recede. It did not disappear. It simply no longer stood at the center. Over time, people no longer needed to hold the cycle with the same degree of tension. Ancient mechanisms were gradually replaced by lighter forms, easier to repeat, easier to sustain, better suited to a world less dependent on ritual for survival. The sacred fire that was once extinguished and relit was no longer necessary. Electric light replaced mandatory darkness. There was no longer a moment when the world was allowed to fall silent. Instead came continuous illumination, unbroken, uninterrupted, leaving no space for emptiness to appear. The pause that once allowed the cycle to reorganize itself was shortened, then slowly faded into something no longer recognized. Vigil became a countdown. The shared wakeful presence of an entire community was replaced by a single number, drawing attention to one point for only a few brief seconds. Remaining through the night, holding awareness until the new order could stand, was exchanged for a precise moment on a clock. Time, once a cycle that had to be held, became a marker that simply had to be reached. Celebration, once delayed until all danger had passed, was moved forward. It became a signal of beginning rather than the result of a completed process. Greetings were spoken earlier. Sounds grew louder, movement became faster. These actions were not wrong, but they carried a different weight. They no longer protected. They marked, rather than ensured. The traditions that remained, cleaning, staying awake, gathering, were still repeated each year. But their original reasons had grown faint. Cleaning became preparation. Staying awake became entertainment. Gathering became festivity. The actions remained, but their function had changed. What were once mechanisms of survival became cultural habits, lighter, quicker, and easier to neglect. This replacement did not occur because people forgot. It occurred because people no longer needed to hold the world in the same way. When order could sustain itself without relying on collective ritual, those rituals withdrew. Not because they were wrong, but because they were no longer summoned with the same intensity. The world continued, but part of the weight that once existed on the final night was dispersed, thinned out, until only a vague sensation remained. And within that vague sensation, ancient memory still quietly persists. It no longer shapes action. It appears as an echo, an emptiness difficult to name, a waiting without a clear object, a moment of stillness even amid noise. These are not accidents. They are the remnants of a structure that once mattered deeply, now present only as the shadow of itself. When looking back at what the modern world has replaced, what was lost was not a specific ritual. What was lost was the weight of waiting. The sense that time had to be treated carefully at its most fragile moment. And though the forms have changed, the echo of that ancient night still returns each year, reminding us that some things were once held not to celebrate, but to ensure that the world could continue in proper rhythm. Even as forms have changed, even as ancient rituals are no longer fully practiced, one thing continues to repeat with strange precision. At the end of every year, even in the modern world, people still feel a kind of emptiness that is difficult to name. Not quite sadness, not quite nostalgia, not quite hope. Just a sense that something is ending, while whatever comes next has not yet truly begun. This feeling does not depend on whether the year has been good or bad. It appears even when things are going well, even when life feels sufficient, even when there is no clear reason for unease. And because it lacks a specific cause, it is often ignored or covered over with noise. Louder music, fuller schedules, new goals set more quickly. Yet, even when obscured, it rarely disappears completely. In ancient memory, this was once the moment reserved for waiting. Not waiting for something good, but waiting for confirmation that the cycle had closed correctly. When the rituals that once held this role are no longer called upon, the feeling remains, but with nowhere to be placed. It drifts, unattached to any concrete action, becoming a vague psychological state rather than part of a shared structure. Many describe this sensation as end-of-year fatigue. Some call it an unnamed sadness. Others experience it as pressure to begin again. But at a deeper level, it is the echo of a night that once carried great importance. A night when people were not permitted to move forward until everything had been set in its proper place. When that mechanism faded, the feeling continued to return, but without its original context. For this reason, the modern end-of-year moment often feels paradoxical. Externally, there is fast movement, constant light, greetings exchanged in quick succession. Internally, there is a brief pause, sometimes only a flicker, where people sense themselves standing between two unresolved states. That pause does not last long, but it is enough to remind us that not every transition can be reduced to a precise moment on a clock. This feeling is not a failure of the present. It is the trace of a structure that existed long enough to be etched into collective memory. Even without being named, it appears at the same time each year. It does not ask to be understood. It does not demand explanation. It simply returns, like a quiet reminder that there were once moments in human life that needed to be crossed far more slowly. And perhaps because this feeling still returns, the final night of the year has never become entirely ordinary. Even wrapped in celebration, it carries a different resonance, a sense that the world is shifting in ways deeper than what the eye can see. A sense that even if we no longer know exactly what to do with it, humanity is still standing before the same ancient threshold, waiting for something to be allowed to complete. As everything gradually returns to familiar rhythm, as the new year moves deeper into ordinary life, the final night does not vanish. It simply steps into the background, like structures that have completed their function and no longer need to stand at the center. Not loudly, not with clear traces left behind, yet still present, holding the entire cycle together so it does not collapse. That ancient night was never erased. It was never fully replaced. The rituals that once surrounded it may have softened, changed form, or lost their original purpose. But the moment when people once had to stop, had to wait, had to hold themselves between two states, continues to exist at a deeper layer of human experience. Each year's end, even without naming danger, people instinctively slow for a brief moment. A short pause before everything continues. A sense that something has just closed, and that what comes next needs a beat to take shape. That pause is no longer protected by ritual, but it still appears like a remaining reflex from a time when time itself was not treated as something to pass through carelessly. In the ancient world, the final night was held because people understood that cycles required attention, that not every ending was naturally safe, that in certain moments, doing nothing at all, no calling, no urging, no celebration, was the most correct action. When these understandings ceased to be fully practiced, they did not disappear. They withdrew, becoming an invisible foundation beneath the feeling people still carry, even when they no longer know why. That night, therefore, does not belong to the past. It does not remain locked in a lost age. It continues as a quiet reference point where humanity, regardless of the form of society it inhabits, still encounters the same truth. Every continuation requires a moment of permission, not from gods, not from ritual, but from the deep structure of human experience itself. And perhaps what matters most is not what has been forgotten, but what remains. Not as custom, not as explicit belief, but as a familiar sensation that returns at the same time each year. A feeling that before moving forward, there must be a moment of stillness, a recognition that a cycle has just closed, and that continuation itself was once important enough to be carefully held. That ancient night has never truly left. It simply no longer needs to be named. And each time a year ends, people unconsciously find themselves standing before the same threshold, carrying the faint memory of a time when staying, waiting, and not rushing were the only ways the world could continue in proper rhythm.